Residents and businesses are in for some major increases in energy costs. This is the Issues Watch podcast. Hi, I'm Jeff Kazerman, Vice President of Government Relations at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to episode 68. Today, we're going to talk about New Jersey's Energy Master Plan, which was released by Governor Murphy in January of 2020. This is an issue that few people except environmentalists and energy lobbyists seem to know much about, and that includes me. I had some hazy idea that there was an energy plan, but was absolutely clueless about what it was. Energy issues are so complicated and so unglamorous that this plan has moved completely under the radar. Well, businesses and homeowners and even renters should start paying attention. This plan could cost them tens of thousands of dollars each. Before I bring on our guests, I'll give you a brief tutorial on what the Energy Master Plan is, because it's actually kind of confusing and complicated. But this will make it easier to follow the discussion. So here we go. New Jersey state law requires the governor to issue an energy master plan every 3 years, though in reality, they're usually issued every 5 years or so. Now, this plan is strictly a guidance document, and it lays out the energy policies that the sitting governor wants the state to pursue over the short, intermediate, and long term. However, and this is important, the plan has no impact in and of itself. Items in the plan don't become law unless the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and the Board of Public Utilities adopt regulations to implement it. So it's only a guidance document, and it doesn't have the weight of law. And the reality is that administrations can ignore their own plan, or they can do parts of it, or they can change it as they see fit. And then when a new administration comes in, they issue their own plan, which might be quite different from the previous plan. And of course, once some or all of this becomes law, well, then it can be very difficult to reverse course without causing tremendous disruption. So the most significant part of Governor Murphy's plan is his goal of making New Jersey's energy sources 50% carbon free by 2030 and 100% by 2050. Carbon free is the more technical term for what is typically called clean energy. And clean energy means, for all practical purposes, electric and nuclear energy. This clean energy goal, one of the most ambitious in the country, would require a massive and expensive effort to convert homes, businesses, and government from natural gas to clean energy. They would need to convert their gas energy equipment over to electric equipment. And this is not cheap. For example, the average home would probably be looking at spending $10,000 to $20,000 on this conversion. And going along with that, there will almost certainly be rate hikes to fund all the changes that the utility companies will have to make. Since 75% of the state's households rely on natural gas as their primary heating fuel, we're talking about a financial burden that will impact a large majority of New Jerseyans. So now that I'm done with my Energy 101 tutorial, let's hear from our experts. Regina Egea is president of the Garden State Initiative, a New Jersey think tank focused on economic and fiscal issues. Regina was chief of staff for Treasurer Andrew Erisoff Sideman during the Christie administration, and then she became the governor's chief of staff for several years. Prior to that, she was an executive with AT&T for more than 30 years. Welcome, Regina.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Our second guest is Mike Butler, executive director of the Mid-Atlantic region of the Consumer Energy Alliance. The Alliance represents industries and companies across the economic spectrum, as well as hundreds of thousands of consumers. Its mission is to seek sensible, realistic, and environmentally responsible solutions to meet the nation's energy needs. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So, Regina, let me ask you something that has really been on my mind, which is how come so few people know about this energy master plan? I don't have a single friend or know a single CPA who has ever mentioned this plan. I myself had a hazy idea that there was something called an energy master plan, but I had no idea what it actually was. And I had no idea that whatever it was, there would be such a tremendous cost that it would have to be borne by businesses and homeowners. Actually, I was shocked when I found out just how expensive it would be. And that's when I decided, geez, I got to do a podcast on this. So, how come nobody knows about this?
Well, it's a great question, and I'd give it a couple of reasons why I think it hasn't gotten more notice. Number one, it's a technical matter, right? I mean, our sources of energy, and it's something that most people don't think about. They turn on their lights and turn on their stoves, and they really don't think about the sources. But recently, helpfully, with the incidents in both California with brownouts and blackouts, and Texas during the storm that they had, people have become much more aware of this, and I'm hopeful this will instigate people to look into this. And then number two, I think the governor has been a strong proponent of renewables, and I think there's generally good support for renewables. But when you really get in and examine it, as we're going to do in the next half hour or so, as you said, Jeff, you find out that there isn't a good balance between the noble objective of moving to renewables and the cost that's going to drive for the consumer and the residents. And I think that's really what we're trying to bring to light here, that there has been zero transparency, frankly, on for ratepayers and for businesses about what this is going to cost. And until you have that, you really can't have a constructive conversation without being in this, very, political environment of, getting shouted down that you're not for renewables. And it's not that, I support moving to it. It's a question of finding that balance.
Right, right. So, can you tell us, Regina, how was this plan developed? Who provided input? And were business and energy groups, were they involved in developing it?
Yeah, I'll give a bit, and then I'm sure Mike will want to comment on that as well. So there is a procedure laid out, and I think, as you said in your intro, it was actually approved and passed now 15 months ago, in January of 2020. And there is it's statutorily required, as you said, and there is a group that is supposed to shepherd it. But one of the observations that have been made by other people really has been that while there's a lot of comment from businesses and from different advocate groups for ratepayers, that those don't seem to have found its way into the actual plan. And by that, I mean, there's no goal in the plan that says we have to balance the ratepayer impact for both businesses and consumer. And then the second observation I made in the document itself, if you go look at it, and because I, am interested, I actually looked at all the appendices. And if you look at those charts, I mean, you can see that there's been some advocates that have participated. And indeed, at the back of the report, you can see there are two advocate organizations, the Rocky Mountain Institute, as well as Evolved Energy, whose sole purpose is to advance renewables without regard, really, frankly, to the public cost. And they are highly influential in this. So I think that's important for everybody to understand, that this was constructed with a lot of advocacy from those who will benefit, frankly, in terms of advancing an agenda that they've got. And then, Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything else on that.
Yes, Regina, you raised an excellent point. This process was very much outsourced to those two entities you just mentioned, in particular the Rocky Mountain Institute, which sounds great. I mean, who doesn't like the Rocky Mountains? But we come across them. Consumer Energy Alliance, we're a national organization. I represent the Mid-Atlantic, as you mentioned, but we come across them, across the country. And just to give you a sense of where they're coming from, in their offices that they just built recently in Colorado, they stick to their beliefs, and they want to reduce demand for energy. So there's no central heating or air. As you you may know about Colorado can get awfully cold, also gets awfully warm. The weather can really fluctuate dramatically if you've ever been there. So to compensate for that, they put in these heated chairs for everyone at $1,900 a pop. It's $140,000 to outfit those chairs. They're the type of heated chairs you may find in a luxury automobile. That just simply isn't practical for families or small businesses. It also can be unsafe. I mean, in the winter, the temperatures in the building could really get quite low. So it's not only, I mean, it's just a ridiculous solution to the circumstances, but that gives you a sense of what they're all about and the kind of extreme ideology they come at these things with.
So Regina, what has happened? Like you said, it was approved in January. And what has happened since then regarding the plan?
Well, interestingly enough, it was approved, as we said, in January, and then really it's enacted. It's really put into place through regulations by the BPU as well as the DEP. And what has been proceeding, and I'm sure Mike will want to comment on this as well, but has been awards and funding, frankly, from the ratepayer base toward advancing some of the goals that they have. And the goals that have been set out in this EMP, for example, are to move to 50% renewable by 2030. That's less than 9 years away. And to give you a sense of where we are today, because I think you were asking about that, Jeff, before, right now we have only 5% of our energy is provided by renewables. So to move from 5 to 50% of the mix of supply of energy, and to have that little to begin with is an incredible financial burden, frankly.
Right.
And so what we're seeing is award after award of support for whether it's to the ports, for supporting the wind industry, for solar. It's an interesting story we can tell you later about solar and how the solar subsidies are being used, as well as support for electric vehicles, which is another component of the movement towards some of these energy sources. So it's been, interestingly enough, since the stay-at-home order happened in March of last year, the BPU and the DEP and the EDA have continued to advance this plan without, again, as far as I know, and Mike, you can correct me, I don't think any ratepayer impact has come out for any of these moves. Is that right, Mike?
That is correct. Part of that is kind of a regulatory circumstance. In conjunction with the Energy Master Plan, not to get too wonky, there's also an integrated energy plan. And the integrated energy plan is typically where they do most of the cost assessments, but they got the timing. They did the EMP first and the IEP second. So this entire EMP has been put together with virtually no analysis or sharing or projection of costs. And those costs, of course, they don't get paid magically. They get paid by the citizens and businesses of New Jersey, and that just isn't being done. Consumer Energy Alliance, we're all of the above energy. We have clients in every energy sector: wind, solar, natural gas, nuclear. We believe in it all. We need it all. But there has to be some rational basis, and I think New Jersey's kind of getting untethered from that. As Regina was kind of alluded to, since the Energy Master Plan has kind of been passed, there've been a few real benchmark things have happened in wind and solar. With wind, New Jersey actually already has put out the largest state procurement of wind electric generation in the country. And they have another bid going out that's nearly twice that size. I think that'll be awarded in June. And again, wind ought to be more. New Jersey's right on the coast. It makes sense to get some offshore wind. But as we sit here today, wind is just vastly more expensive. And it doesn't really, with all due respect to New Jersey is not that significant a factor in global emissions. So to put that kind of cost burden on their own ratepayers and citizens for really marginal, at best, environmental gains, it's really unfortunate. And it's also unfortunate it's happened without a real robust debate on it. It's one thing if it was really out in the public and everyone got to weigh in, and this is the way everyone decided to go. It's another thing to kind of go through a back door and go through kind of a clandestine process that most of the public just isn't aware of, that the legislature doesn't weigh in on at all. It's really unfortunate On the solar front, they've allocated money for workforce development, which is great. There will be more jobs in the green economy, and that's great. And the state needs to help folks transition into that. But it's at a real cost. And in New Jersey, it's kind of, I don't want to say comical, but it kind of is comical in that the solar industry in New Jersey is more expensive than their out-of-state competitors. So while the state has allocated $500 million for this process, which is already an expensive cost again, and I want New Jerseyans to get New Jersey jobs, but you'll be spending more to do that process. So you're already adding this huge cost burden, and then you're doing it in the least cost-effective manner of achieving that getting that work done. And again, that comes back to everyone's pocketbooks. And even before the COVID crisis hit, families were really stretched. There's stats, and you guys probably know better than I, specifically for New Jersey, but there's some studies in the United States abroad, across the United States, that 39% of families don't have $1,000 in savings. And that was pre-COVID. So you imagine what folks are dealing with this last year, to just keep jacking up these costs, again, in a process that really has not been out in the public much, is just, I think it's not terribly unfair to New Jerseyans.
And Jeff, if you don't mind, I just wanted to go back and emphasize one point, which is, I think, important for listeners to understand about our carbon footprint, at this point. Because we use 95% of the energy that's supplied in New Jersey is either nuclear or natural gas, which are extremely low emission, right? So that's 94% of the energy that's supplied for heating and lights, right, are that low emission. So, and the 5% are renewables. So what this is really about, it's really not about emissions, right? This is really about moving to renewables. And the point is, right, we shouldn't finance the development of those new industries on the backs of ratepayers. There ought to be investors, private markets. If they're so attractive, that's who would be financing this. Because that's why Mike said that there's a marginal gain when you introduce more wind into our mix of emissions reduction, because we're already very low. Make sense?
Yeah. So I have one last sort of technical question. When I was looking at the report and the articles, the word I kept hearing was clean energy, in the 50% by 2030, 100% by 2050. And I think the word you use was renewables. Are they the same thing? And just, can you briefly tell us what they mean by clean energy?
Sure. In some ways, yes, they are the same. I would say that it's a little different. In clean energy is kind of used as a kind of propagandist tactic to try to distinguish it as being somehow vastly superior. We look at it more as whether it's renewable or traditional energy. As Regina just alluded to, natural gas has brought incredible environmental benefits to New Jersey, to the United States. Emissions are dropping across the board of any pollutant you can name. They've all dropped dramatically over the last 20 years, largely due to the natural gas boom. She mentioned nuclear. Nuclear is zero emissions itself. So those kind of get left out when you talk about the clean energy. They're trying to make this distinction that's a little unfair. So yes, clean energy is certainly wind and solar, but I would argue that the gains you get from nuclear and natural gas are also clean energy. So that's why I refer to as renewables versus traditional energy. But that's, I think, a little bit of a shell game that someone plays to try to bolster their political credibility on that.
Right. One last technical question, but I think it's an easy one. So Mike, roughly speaking, how much of the energy used in this state is provided by gas, electricity, and nuclear?
Well, nuclear and natural gas account for 94% currently of our energy or if you will, electricity generation. 75% of households use natural gas. So it's the overwhelming majority of New Jersey's energy base comes from natural gas and nuclear. Unfortunately, there's some plants that are scheduled to come offline. So again, if climate change is your number one priority, this is not the time in New Jersey or anywhere else that we should be taking nuclear offline. But
right. But nuclear sounds dangerous, after nuclear wars and whatever. But I assure you folks, it has nothing to do with a nuclear bomb.
Well, and it's a provider of great jobs in South Jersey. right? There's a lot of
Right.
jobs in South Jersey that support those plans.
Right. And some of them are in
They're very good
financial.
jobs, family sustaining jobs.
Right.
These pay big money. They're often labor, organized labor jobs. So
Yep.
if you believe in a labor, if you believe in organized labor, you should believe in those jobs.
Right. Right. So now let's get into some stuff that I think might
Good.
be easier to digest, though it's not good. So Regina, can you expand upon why the plan is bad for homeowners and businesses, which I assume is pretty much all connected to the costs?
Well, right, because we just explained, right? We just went through it. Environmentally, this it's not about an environmental issue. This is really about an industry changeover, which will inexorably continue. But from the business's perspective and a cost of living perspective, energy in New Jersey is already more expensive than the US average, with the exception of natural gas, as Mike was just alluding to. That's provided tremendous, cost benefit for the state of New Jersey. But right now, electricity in our homes are about 25% higher than the US average. Commercial power is 14%, and overall industrial costs for power is 51% higher than US average. So right now, if we really want to believe that New Jersey wants to be competitive and bring more jobs and retain individuals, raising the cost of energy is not going to improve that. And I would also, point to, California, if we can talk about that for a few minutes.
Sure.
You've been, front leading, right, this, advancement into renewable. And last the numbers I saw was that California has advanced almost 40% of the power that they supply themselves, which is not 100%, but 40% of what they produce are renewables. And their costs are twice the US average, like 100% higher than the US averages in some categories.
Right.
So you can see that if you get ahead of the curve, it's going to just cost more and more. And then as the last point, I guess, from a residential perspective, I think that the percent of income, that the typical homeowner, spends is the first cost is housing, the second cost is food, and the third cost is power, to both heat and light their homes. And when you look at the middle class in New Jersey, while the average, there's a lot of people talk about the average cost is only about 2.3 or 2.5% of income in New Jersey. When you look at the middle class, it's more like 6 and 7% of their income is devoted to energy. So again, I think that ought to be the balancing, and that frankly, the mechanism that we think about how quickly we want to go.
Yeah, and it goes way beyond just the rate hikes. The conversion costs are what really caught my eye. Can either of you give us like an guesstimate on what this plan would cost, let's say a homeowner, over the next 10 years in conversion costs? And let's just assume the house is, no more than 40 years old and it's of average size.
I think that's kind of one of the unfortunate circumstances, is that this has not really been cost out effectively in the plan. So people are going into this a little blind. So we can make some suppositions, but just to give you an anecdote, there had been a subsidy for folks to be able to move from propane heating to natural gas. If that were to go away, that's $3,000 a year to install. It's $500 a year more to operate. And if you don't do it, then you're burning like a more dangerous fuel in propane than natural gas, more environmentally dangerous fuel. So those kind of things are littered throughout this process. As Regina was just mentioning, the cost to a middle income family, the cost to a low income family is even more extraordinary than that. On average in New Jersey, and pays about $3,100 in energy bills. As Regina mentioned, that's about 28% higher than national average. But if you're a low-income family, that's not 5 or 6% of your total gross earnings. That's 25, 35%. So as all this is going to have to be built out, imagine we already have these incredible challenges to get affordable home ownership. We now have to build all these homes to these codes. You already have this incredible pent-up demand for more affordable housing. I don't know how you do that if you're now going to have to institute all of these environmental fixes, if you will. So it's real alarming. To do the entire, we did analysis, and you can check this out on our website, consumerenergyalliance.org. we talked about what would be the cost of changing the entire electric grid in the United States. It'd be about $5.7 trillion. That works out to about 115 billion prorated for New Jersey, or almost 13,000 for every New Jersey citizen. So these things would add up to just an extraordinary cost. And again, a cost that just has not been out there to be robustly debated.
So there's a cost associated with the energy companies having to switch over and change their formats and structure. And then there's the cost to the consumer, the homeowner, for actually converting his home from gas to electricity. Is that the right way to say that?
Yeah, basically it's a conversion, taking out what we all traditionally think of, natural gas enabled heating systems, and converting it to like heat pumps, really provided by electricity, provided by the renewables, right? And I think you mentioned in your introduction, right, Jeff, as a, just for the listeners to remember that, the estimates inside most of the studies that were done that I think the EMP leaned on were, several $1,000s to convert. But in Boston, I think the study, that of actually what it was taking was much more like $13,000 and $20,000, in some cases $35,000. And that's borne, not to forget, that's borne by the homeowner. And this is Mike's point about this just adds to the cost of home ownership. This is not paid for by, the subsidies from the state or from the BPU. And the lifespan of those new pieces of equipment are half of what the tried and true natural gas, enabled systems that we all have in our homes. So instead of it being a 30 years investment, it's every 15 years. So you're doubling the maintenance cost now for the, heating infrastructure in the homes.
So, Mike, what changes to the plan do you think should be made to make it less costly, but still effective?
Well, one, I mean, again, we've both mentioned this. I mean, I think I wish the process had been more transparent. I just think in public policy, it's just vital that is just a transparent as possible process, and that people really get to go in with their eyes wide open to what they're signing on for. And there's certainly aspects of it. I mean, again, the aspiration of it is fine. There are aspects of it that we ought to pursue, but I think it's more the pace that you pursue it, and to just get, as I mentioned earlier on the wind procurement, to get that aggressive this early, it's just counterproductive. It's not to say that there shouldn't be or couldn't be more wind in the mix, but why is it happening now this year? Those are the type of things of just, let's just slow down and kind of do this kind of piece by piece and look at what should the pace of this implementation be, and what are the costs? I mean, if again, for the advocates of the green energy or clean energy, they're talking about how dramatically the costs are dropping, which is true in some circumstances. But you have to wait and, but why not then wait a few years and reassess it and say, okay, they're now more cost competitive. Let's start transitioning to these things then. Or other things, like electronic vehicles. I don't doubt in the not too distant future, that'll be the bulk of the fleet out there. But in the interim, Tesla is not affordable to a middle-class family. I mean, it's extraordinarily expensive. And so the state has a subsidy for you to buy a Tesla. So at a time where government revenues are incredibly stretched, we're not going to put a subsidy in for the most well-off taxpayers to buy a Tesla. I mean, those are things that just, I mean, it's not real leadership. It's kind of just ideologically posturing in a really counterproductive manner. So I really think you'd have to kind of go back to the whole plan and I hate to say, but you almost have to start to do it honestly, and you got to go back and kind of start over. It's just, the process has been too flawed, and the goals are too rosy, if you will, and it sets you down on a real bad and impractical path. And the only thing that will happen is that people are going to pay more, some jobs will be lost, and then you're not really going to have moved the needle in any meaningful way.
And if I could add, Jeff,
Sure.
to the business community has been speaking out about this, right? I mean, you can find quotes from all of them, including Tony Russo, right? Just talk about, this issue of, and it's not even it is the pace, but it's also the opaqueness, right? What businesses need is, as you know better than me, Jeff, right? Ability to plan And if you have no visibility into what this cost is going to be over the next 5 to 10 years, you just know what percent of energy sources we're going to have, you discourage businesses from being willing to invest here. So you can't, you can't, there are fixes you can put in this plan. For example, if I'll offer, if you don't mind, right, you can put, caps in here, right? You won't let energy expand or cost of energy to accelerate more than X percent. And you could say X percent of the year, X year over year, X percent compared to the average, X percent a baseline that it was last year. And there's lots of ways to put throttles in here so that it doesn't become runaway. And by the time the consumers and the businesses get the bill, they've got no control over what's happening with the cost basis. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So now, Regina, I have some political questions for you regarding this this whole issue, and I know you know the political landscape better than anyone. So here we go. What do members of the legislature think of this plan?
Well, by the way, as you know, I'm nonpartisan at GSI, so I'll respond with that, as a context. But there have been, a few members who've been willing to speak out, most notably Senator Bucco. I mean, he's been from the beginning, out there talking about, again, not objecting to the idea of moving to renewables, but the transparency on cost. And he's been writing and speaking about this, most notably. Others have been less public about it. And I think even the BPU, made some comments in public that, they're concerned that it is expensive, but on the other hand, they're executing on the EMP. So unless the legislature, I think, becomes a bit more vocal, I haven't seen more than Senator Bucco. Mike, I don't know if there's anybody else you would point to, but Senator Bucco has been the most vocal.
Yeah, I haven't heard a thing.
Yeah, I think Senator Bucco has been a real champion here. But I think one of the ways to get the legislature more engaged on this and more publicly outspoken is for your listeners to make sure they're contacting their local state rep or state senator. Again, as we had mentioned, this has been a very, regulatory process driven through the administration. Not a whole lot of role for the legislature to play, but it is a political season. It's an election season in New Jersey. And one of the ways to make that happen is for them to hear from their constituents.
Okay, so one thing that kind of confuses me, or that I can't quite figure out why this is happening, is obviously if you have a lot of money and you're upper middle class or wealthy, you could probably, what the hell, let the state go ahead and do this, and I'll help the environment, and I can pay for conversion costs because I make $500,000 a year and I love the environment, so on and so forth. And it would seem to some extent the plan is targeted or would only affect people like that, since there doesn't seem to be much consideration of the cost. But as we've discussed, this plan, its implementation would have a much harder impact on lower income New Jerseyans who are homeowners. So my question is, where, if anywhere, are the groups, the organizations that represent whose a lot of their members are lower income New Jerseyans? I mean, have they come out against this plan or said, like, whoa, slow down? I mean, I would think their constituencies would be, very hard hit by this plan.
Well, I'll start, and then Michael, I'm sure, will expand upon it. And I think Mike's organization has done much to really help groups understand the impact. To your point, it's been very opaque, not really talked about. But there are a few who really are understanding, particularly those that represent some of our urban areas that have, individuals who are in the group that's going to be economically disadvantaged. And by the way, it's not just homeowners, right? Renters too, right? Everybody's going to be, affected by this. But, Pastor David Jefferson, who's been in the news the last couple of months, frankly, speaking out about some of the community that are just not being considered in lots of policy decisions, but in particularly in this one. I mean, there are, I think the last number I heard anyway, of those who have deferred paying their energy bills during the pandemic was over $700 million. And those are individuals who are, going to be impacted by these escalating rates. And Pastor Jefferson in Newark, he's one of the largest, congregations in Newark. He's been saying, this move is not considering, those who are going to be hurt the worst, and where 6 and 8 and 10% of their take-home pay is going to go to energy, and it's simply not affordable. And we're seeing that as a result of the, deferred payments for during the pandemic. And I don't know if there's other groups, Mike, you'd want to point to.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm glad you brought up Reverend Jefferson. We actually did a joint forum with him in his congregation. We had a number of experts come in and have a very frank conversation with the congregation, great give and take and Q&A. And he's really been kind of a leader on this, of understanding. I mean, in New Jersey, 10% of New Jersey lives below the poverty line. That's 900,000 people. And again, higher energy costs it's not a trivial issue to them. It's very much a kitchen table. I got to make choices between having my utilities and enough food, and it's very just heart-wrenching to see the families have to struggle with. So he's been a leader on this. We also did with Pastor Bartley, also in Newark. They had a tech center there. We did the same thing with members of his community. Reverend Green down in Irvington, New Jersey. ARP has come to some of the more kind of industry roundtables to learn more. So I think there are folks who are starting to get attuned to what this will mean. To your point, it can be easy for a lot of folks to say, hey, these few $100s a year more, few $1,000s a year more doesn't matter that much to me personally, but it does matter to a lot of your fellow neighbors there. But also, even though, again, even you, the individual, can take on that cost, as Regina mentioned earlier, businesses are part of this too.
Right.
New Jersey already you're already one of the highest tax states. You already have one of the highest energy costs. If you continue to add to that, New Jersey is kind of right up there with California for folks who have been leaving. And if businesses can't operate, that will only expedite that exodus of people and talent. So even for those who are really well off and won't feel it in their pocketbooks, again, we're all interconnected. And natural gas so far has saved the last 10 years, from 2006 to 2016, and we did an analysis of this, saved New Jersey ratepayers $21 billion, $11 billion for residential, $9 billion for commercial and industry. There's no reason to reverse that. In fact, you should be doing more to keep increasing those savings, so you make New Jersey a more competitive state compared to the rest of the United States, but also globally. We're in a global economy, and you should want your economy to be as competitive as possible. So this, whether you're low income, middle income, or higher income, these costs have real consequences.
Yeah, and I guess I should have said throughout this that, like you mentioned, this is not just a homeowner thing. Businesses are going to be hit. A small business that owns a little building somewhere is going to have the same problems with having to spend $10,000, $20,000 on converting. And so everything we were just talking about in terms of homeowners also applies to businesses. But won't there eventually be a real political backlash once people start paying these bills? Or just finding out, in a concrete terms, what it's going to cost. Like, I can imagine myself or any homeowner, being informed one way or the other, hey, you have 3 years to convert to phase 1 of this new equipment. And then, you look it up and that's like $5,000. Do you foresee, Regina, some sort of big backlash eventually that's going to hurt whoever's in office at the time?
That's the point, right? When does that happen? Of course, but the goal would be that you haven't already spent the money and now you're just collecting it from the ratepayers. The goal, and that's why I've started to spend more time in this category, frankly, because it is about competitiveness and it is about the cost of living in New Jersey. And I'm going to try to do my best to articulate for both the individuals and the businesses that when you just looking at the goals of this plan, this is going to escalate dramatically. And we can look at California as a great benchmark, right? This is how much it's going to go up, and why not get involved now? And why not put, backstops on this thing and caps so that we can keep control and create more, transparency. So it'll be too late. If we wait, frankly, another 2 years or another 5 years, it'll be too late because these things are marching along.
Right.
Okay. Just, I think you're going to hear that another 20 million is going to be allocated out of, what they call the, the subsidy that are set aside from the ratepayers to invest in new technology. We're going to hear another 50 million for the port, right down in Paulsboro or Camden, to support the energy industry that they're also trying to build here. But, that I don't know that that's exactly what people intended when they, set aside that money for the for the support of lower income. Really, it was intended to support, right? I mean, keep everybody's lights and heat on, not necessarily build an industry. And that's what's going on.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that this issue, energy issues, environmental issues, can be so technical because it's hard for people, the average Joe, and well, I guess that includes me, to really understand what's going on until they get a bill,
Yeah.
and then it's, then they know and it's too late. So, well, that about wraps it up. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. Good to see you again, Regina. Mike,
you too, Jeff.
Nice to meet you. And I'm sure our members found this insightful, and now hopefully they are ready to ace their Energy Master Plan 101 final exam. And if they need any tutoring, I will send them to both of you. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
To learn more about Garden State Initiative, visit gardenstateinitiative.org or follow them on Twitter at GSI_New Jersey. To learn more about the Consumer Energy Alliance, visit consumerenergyalliance.org or follow them on Twitter at CEAORG.